Welcome to Gazroth Tutorials. I'm Gazroth, and today we're going to start a new YouTube series. This series is going to focus on bringing you from Codeblocks to TypeScript. So I'm still going to show you how to do it in Codeblocks, but then I'm going to show you how to do the exact same thing in TypeScript. And the topic for this video is going to be on triggers. We're in the desktop editor, and in order to pull out a trigger, we're going to go up to this build tab up here, and we're going to go to gizmos. And we're just going to click and drag this trigger here, and we're going to also grab a shape. And I'm going to grab a cube. I'm just going to bring it right behind. So if I click on the trigger, we have our properties. So this is the same thing as the properties panel in VR. We can adjust the position, rotation, and scale. We can enable it or disable it. We can set whether it's triggered on players or objects. We can give it an object tag, which we're just going to give it cube for now. And then we have selectable in screen mode. And if I toggle this on, it gives us some more options. It gives us the interaction prop icon, so we can change this to a different icon if we want. And then we have the interaction distance. Now this is only going to work in mobile or desktop. We don't need to give it a gameplay tag. So now we're going to click on the cube, and we have the properties panels we do in VR, but the only thing that we need to worry about is the gameplay tag. So if we click on our trigger again, we gave the object tag cube. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to click back on here. I'm going to hit this plus sign, and I'm going to paste it in there. So now we're going to go into VR. If you have your headset hooked up to your computer via Link or AirLink, you can go into VR directly from the desktop edit. And I'm going to click on this to VR, switch to VR button. All right, so here we are in VR, and I have our trigger, and I have our cube, and I'm just going to, so I'm going to go down to my snapping tool here and just snap it there. So it's much easier to do in VR. But we do need to pull out a Codeblocks script. You can't place a Codeblock script gizmo in the desktop editor, so you have to come into VR to do it. And in order to do that, we're going to hit the hamburger button on the left controller, and it's going to bring up our build menu. So we're going to go to gizmos, grab our script. It doesn't really matter where you put it, and if we open it, here we can change the name. So I'm going to call this one CB triggers. And there's two types of triggers. There's a player trigger, and then there's an object trigger. So there's different sets of events that we can look for. So if we go under events, and we go down to collision events, we'll see when trigger is entered by object and when trigger is exited by object. So I'm just going to click and drag those in there. And then if we go down to player events, we have the same ones but for the player. So when trigger is entered by player and when trigger is exited by player. However, there are more events that we can connect to. So under our when world is started, we want to connect. So we're going to go under events all the way down to connections. We're going to connect to event. We're just going to click and drag. We're going to duplicate that. And this might be a little confusing, but I'll try to explain it. We're going to connect to an object. So the object either has to have a script on it or has to be a gizmo. And since we are going to connect to the trigger, and this script is also going to be on the trigger, we just need to do self. And what we're going to do is we're going to connect to empty and occupied. What those do is occupied only runs when the first object or player enters the trigger. So if the first is still in there and a second one enters, it will not fire. Only when the first one enters. Now empty, so you have one person in and they leave, it's empty, so it's going to fire. But if you have two and one leaves, it's not going to fire because it's not empty. So now we have to connect those to a local event. And since there isn't any events for empty and occupied, we have to create one. So we're going to go all the way up to the top. Under events, one event is received. We're going to get two of these, and we're going to name them empty and occupied. And we can just change these local events from enter to empty and occupied. Now keep in mind that when a trigger is entered or exited, it sends a variable with it. And it's the same way with empty and occupied. If it was a player trigger, you would want a player variable. If it's an object, you want an object. We're going to do object because I can't showcase with just me. I need two. and I can get two objects. So we're going to make this of type object. We're going to call it obj, and we're going to create an object variable for this one as well, obj. Now, in order to properly showcase all these, I'm going to print to the console. So we're going to go over here, we're going to go to values, under debugging, debug print, and I'm just going to paste one in each of these events. Okay, so now that I have all our debug prints set up, we are going to test. The first thing we need to do is we need to connect our script to our trigger. So we're just going to open up our trigger panel under attached scripts, and we'll grab our CB triggers. And we're going to make sure trigger set to player, and we're going to turn on this, and then once we enter and exit that trigger, this should populate, and we're going to go into play mode, enter our trigger, exit our trigger, and we have player enter and exit. Now we're going to set it to objects tagged, and I'm going to actually duplicate this quick. When I enter this trigger, I get object entered and triggered occupied. Now when I enter with this cube, I get object entered, but I don't get trigger occupied because it wasn't the first. Now when I remove it, I get exit, but no empty because there's still one inside it. And then if I remove this trigger, I get exit and empty because it is now empty. There is one other code block I would like to share. So we're going to go back to our library, we're going to open it up. And it is under actions, and it's set trigger detection. I'm just going to do this on trigger entered by object, and we're going to set self to false. Self being the object. So since the object is a trigger, we can do this, but if it was a different object, if you had a reference to it, you would just drop the reference to the trigger. So now, when I go to our console, I'm going to clear, and I'm going to reset it. Oh, we want that up yet. If I bring in our cube, we get our enter and occupy, but when I remove it, nothing happens. And that's because the trigger is no longer on. And that is all I have for the Codeblocks script. So I'm going to go back into the desktop editor quick. So the Codeblocks still run in the desktop editor. So if I were to let's turn the world on, grab our cube and bring it in, I still get our Codeblock debug prints. So I want to do a couple things before we get started in the TypeScript. I want to grab our trigger and set it back to player. And I just want to show you what this selectable in screen mode looks like. If I go into play mode, I get the E. And what this E is just allowing me to interact with the trigger. So if I enter the trigger, nothing happens. But if I hit E, you notice that I get player enter and player exit at the same time. So if you're going to use this selectable in screen mode, just be mindful that player enter and exit runs when they press the E button. The next thing we need to do is create a script. So we're going to go to scripts, and we're going to see that we can view our Codeblock trigger script. So if you want to actually see the Codeblock, what you do is you spawn in the gizmo and you open in viewer, and now you can actually see the Codeblocks. And I'll try to do a side-by-side comparison of this when we're done with the TypeScript. We're going to close this panel for now. And what we're going to do is, there's two ways you can create the scripts. You can create a new script by hitting this plus sign, or not all objects have this. You can go down. Let's remove our Codeblocks scripts. I can attach script, and I can attach a new trigger script. Now if I go to the cube and I try to do that, I can just attach a new script, which is a blank script. But if I go over here and I attach a trigger script, and let's call this TS triggers, create and attach, what that's going to do is it's going to create a pre-built trigger script for us. So now we want to open it, so let's go into our scripts, and we're going to click on TS triggers, and it's going to open up in whatever IDE you have it set to. I personally use Visual Studio Community. You can use whatever you want. So just keep in mind, mine might look a little different because I use Community. So this is what the pre-generated trigger script looks like. So it's going to go over it a little bit. We have our import at the top. we have to import certain things from the Horizon core library in order to get the trigger to work. Anytime you create a TypeScript script in Horizon, you're going to import from at least one of the Horizon libraries, and there are several, but we don't need to worry about the other ones. We're only going to worry about core for now. And we notice that it only imported 4 things from that library. Now you could import everything from the library, but we don't want to import things that we don't need to use. We don't need any props definitions. A props definition, if set up properly, will make it viewable in the property panel. Just like creating a variable in the Codeblocks script. Now pre-start is where we do all our connections. So in the Codeblocks script, we do it on when world is started. But in TypeScript, it's best to do it in pre-start. Pre-start runs before start, and start runs before update were to run, or start running, I should say. Then we have our connect Codeblock events. So this is very similar to how we did the connect for empty and occupied in the Codeblocks script. So we have our connect Codeblock events. What object is it? It's the entity or object that this script is attached. They don't use object because object is a protected word in TypeScript, so they couldn't use it. That's why we use entity. So this Codeblock event is like an enum or an array that has a list of all of the events that are in the Codeblocks script, and then you could just change it to whatever you want. We're working on trigger, so we have onPlayer enter trigger, and then we're then connecting it to the onPlayer trigger event down here. Now they do bind, which it's not the best way to do it. There's some issues with how TypeScript does this bind function. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you how I like to do it. So I declare the type of variables it's sending, and if we look at it here where this pop-up is, right next to where it's the green Codeblock event, it says entered by player. Entered by is just the name of the variable. You can name it whatever, but it does take a type player. So we're going to open bracket, name our variable. I'm just going to name it P, and we're going to give it the type player. Now, I also have to then tell it which function to run. So I'm going to tell it to run this.onPlayer enter trigger. But I also have to send that player variable along with it. And then we're going to close out that code and then end the line. Now we're going to do the exact same thing here, but this is, remember, this is entity. So what we're going to do is we're going to call this obj, and it's going to be of type entity. And instead of onPlayer enter trigger, we're going to go on entity enter trigger, and we're going to send object. And I'm just going to separate the object and the player triggers, because right now it only gives us the player enter and the object enter. There are other ones that we want. For instance, we want the onPlayer exit trigger. So we're this.connect Codeblock event, because it's a Codeblock event, this.entity, and then we're going to go Codeblock events, plural, and it's onPlayer exit, go down to trigger, and again it's going to be a player variable, so we're going to call it P of type player, and we're going to have it send to onPlayer exit trigger, and we're going to send the P variable, and we're going to end our line. Now it's going to give us this squiggly red line under here. It's because we don't actually have the code for that yet set up yet. So we're just going to go down here and we're going to paste it. We're going to request or expect a player variable called player, and we're just going to add a console here, and all this is going to say is player name exited the trigger. And we're going to do the same thing here, but this time I'm just going to copy and paste it, and we're just going to change what we need. This is on entity exit trigger, and it's object, and I'm just going to do that, and I'm going to copy that, and then exited. So it's a little bit quicker that way. Now in our Codeblock version, we did empty and occupied, and we can do the exact same thing here. However, it's a little different. Oh, we get rid of this one here. I don't know why that's there. So we're only going to do for the object, and in order to do this, we have to go this dot connect Codeblock event, and it's this dot entity again. However, just like in the other one, we had to create a new event, a new Codeblock event. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the new keyword, and we're going to say it's a Codeblock event. And this time it's singular, not plural. And we have to declare the type of variable we expect to receive. And it's going to be an object of type entity. And we gotta remember to put in our closing tags. We also have to put in the name that should be received. Like, what is the name of the event that's coming in? And it's going to be occupied. And then we have to also, again, declare the prop type. So we're going to put in prop types, and it's of type entity. The prop types dot entity, and it didn't add it, so I got to go up here and import prop types. Now it should, yep, entity. And then just like with the other ones, we have to do this bit here. And what we're going to do is we're just going to paste that in here. And then instead of on entity exit trigger, it'll be on entity trigger occupied. And we'll just copy the name there, paste it there, and I'll grab that whole thing. And since it's an entity, we can do this. And it'll be entity, we can do this. We can go trigger, let's call it trigger occupied. How about that? And then we'll do the exact same thing, but this time it's going to be for the empty. Everything's going to be the same except for this is empty, and then this is on trigger, on entity trigger empty, and we can, or emptied, IED. That's better. Makes more sense. You always want to name your events in a way that makes sense. And trigger is empty. With the way it's set up, it's almost like we had it, but we're just going to test all these quick. Make sure we have our TS trigger on, make sure set to player, we're going to hit clear. And now when we hit run, we enter the trigger. It says Gozroth entered the trigger, I exit the trigger, Gozroth exited the trigger. Okay, so that's working. And now we're going to set this to objects tagged. I spelled it wrong. So we have to make sure we spell our stuff right. Bring that one in, bring this one in and out, and then this one out, we get trigger empty. So that is how we get those to work. If you want to disable the trigger, it's a little bit different than how we did it with Codeblocks. It's not as easy. We have to use this dot entity, which is the trigger. So if this script was on a different object, you would reference the trigger and then use that reference. So this dot entity, we have to declare it as a trigger gizmo. So TypeScript doesn't know. It knows it's an entity, but it doesn't know what type. So we have to tell it what type it is. It's a trigger gizmo. And then we go dot, and then we have enabled. Oh, I have to also import that. So we're going to go up here. We're going to import trigger gizmo, and now I can dot enabled. And we just can't, we can't do false. So that's not going to work. We have to dot set, and then in brackets, put false. Turn the simulation on. If I go in, I get our enter, occupied, I bring it out, nothing. And that is the TypeScript. And now I'm going to try to, the screen might be a little small, but I'm going to try to do a side-by-side. So here we have our when world is started. We use it in pre-start in TypeScript, but if we look at the connect, it's very similar. So connect, self, we're using connect Codeblock events. This says connect, self, this that entity, same thing. And then we have empty. So this new code block events object occupied empty. So this here, this whole bit here is the same as just typing in empty or occupied here. And then if we scroll over, we have two local event empty occupied, and this bit is this bit here. So now if we scroll down, we have when trigger is entered by object, and we have our when trigger on entity enter trigger here. So the naming's a little different, but we're still getting an object variable. We're still printing to the log, and we're still setting the detection of the trigger to false. Where we say set trigger detection to false, and here we set the enabled variable on the trigger to false. And then we have when trigger is exited by object, which we have here. When trigger is entered by player, when trigger is exited by player, and then we have our when empty and occupied, which we have here. Trigger occupied, triggered empty. So it's a little different, but once you see them side by side and break them down a little bit, it's actually quite the same. And so that is all I have for triggers. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about the video, please let me know in the comment section below. And if you liked the video, if you learned something, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you are notified of all my future videos. And yeah, thanks for watching, and have a good one.